Welcome back, everyone. While it wasn't quite months, I do hope that you had a nice lunch. Jeff, I would like to go immediately to you to see how you would like to start this afternoon session out.
Sure. We plan to call another caucus, but before we do that, we'd like to take a pulse check on the transfer of credit language.
Sounds good. Excuse me. Remember, in a pulse check, this is non-determinative. It is sort of a temperature check to see where the room is around the issue. So you have three options. You can be a thumbs up, which means you would be in support of it. You can be a thumbs down, which means that you would actually block consensus on this particular issue where it is now, or you can be a middle thumb, which means you still have some lingering questions and concerns. I reserve the right to call upon you if you are a thumbs down or a thumbs sideways so that you can speak to your reasoning and rationale, which will be informative to both the department and the committee at large. Any questions before I take this pulse check? Then I would ask that everyone right now show me their thumbs on the last issue. Excellent. Thumbs up. All right, Jeff, where would we like to go next?
Thank you. At this point, we would like to call a caucus on the topics of academic freedom and references to accrediting agency responsibilities with regard to civil rights enforcement.
Who would we like to be included, and roughly how much time do we think we need?
I say we go to 2:15, and we have the accreditors, Jennifer, AD from the Civil Rights, and that would include nascent accreditors too. And Jim, Siri, trying to think of Ray, do you want to be on this one? You do? Okay. Who can we exclude?
You need someone around also.
What's that?
You need someone.
Okay. Julie, do you want to take a break on this one? Or no? Yeah, we want institutions in on this one, I think.
Okay, are we clear on who is not participating in this caucus?
Okay. Everyone but Ray. Sorry, Ray.
Thank you, Ray. We're going to take till about 2:15. This is a large caucus, so I am going to ask that folks who are not participating in the caucus begin to exit the room. And while they're doing that, Jennifer, I know you have a question.
Yeah, so topic's fine, but I do have a question, because a lot of those provisions are within 1617 that include student achievement issues. And so I have raised that before. Are we just not going to caucus on?
We're not going to caucus on the organization of 16 versus 17. We're going to caucus on specifically on the appropriateness of the language that people have raised issues on, and the issues around what will agencies review and what are the expectations of agencies with regard to these responsibilities.
Okay, well, I may call caucus later.
Thank you for that. And with that, we are going to go from live, go into caucus. And again, I ask everyone to start exiting this room. Welcome back, everyone. Again, I want to thank everyone for a productive caucus and everyone else for their patience. I do want to recognize Primary Michael Shires back at the table for organizations representing taxpayers. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Jeff, for a report out coming out of that last caucus.
Sure. So I think we had a pretty productive caucus discussing the issues mostly around academic freedom. And I think we may have a possible compromise that the department's going to work on and bring back and talk with a couple of the negotiators, and we'll present that as soon as possible. Hopefully by tomorrow morning, I think we can at least give you something. Also, with regard to our other issue on separate and independent versus conflict of interest. Thank you. Beth's been working on some language. We're going to take a look at that tonight, and we will get that out ASAP so you guys can see that when we're done with it. So both those big rocks, I think we're making good progress. And this is sort of the last set of big rocks, which is the 16-17 issue. This is one I think we can do. We don't have to do a caucus on. We can do an open session. And we would like to walk through. To preface this, I want to say that we are open in Section 17 or 602-17 to changes that tighten up the language. We're open to cross-reference, specific cross-references where people think we should do it to 16. So open to that. We'd like to just walk through that, and I think we can take notes, and that would be the basis for yet another counter proposal coming back. And to the extent that people had language that was on those, we can discuss why maybe we didn't take it or consider those proposals, compromises on those proposals as well. So we're going to start at the top of 602-17. Now, I will note that I think in a few instances, some of these may cross over to the other reworks that we're doing, and we'll note that in the instances that they pop up.
David, please.
Just a clarifying question. Are we going to work through all of the language, or is this more about just the structure?
I was going to go paragraph by paragraph, but if in some cases it makes sense to just talk about it more globally, and because it becomes repetitive after a while, we would be open to talking about it in the broader context.
Okay, I have a question on page 48 on number 1, which starts with maintains clearly specified educational objectives. I think Jen explained this to me and I just forgot, so forgive me. But this seems it seems to duplicate the list of outcome measures, which also comes with minimum expectations and so forth. So do we actually need both this provision and the more detailed one on outcome measures? (602-17A1), page 48.
While we're considering a response to David, I do want to acknowledge that for state officials, we're going to swap out and bring the alternate Michael Duffy to the table. So welcome, Michael. Department, do you want me to pause at this moment in response to David, or would you like me to move on to additional cards?
Sorry. So, David, so your question is whether the references to student performance here are redundant with another section? I'm just trying to understand.
Yes, the section in 60217 that lists outcome measures by program with, and I think those also include minimum expectations and so forth. Is it really all the same thing, or is there some new content in here that's not found later?
I think and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to go through the thought process here on that. I believe what we were doing here was we were signaling, because this has historically been a general set of requirements that we were calling out
Yeah.
student performance specifically, and including in the objectives that there were minimum expectations within this context, which I don't believe is repetitive of the other sections. I mean, we have many sections actually dealing with student achievement, student performance, but I don't think the minimum expectations piece is one of them.
Thank you, Jeff. Any follow-up, David, before I move on?
I'm just thinking through, with my hat of writing to these standards on, it seems like what we would do is pull out those outcome measures set at minimum expectations and then be satisfying both of these things. So it seems like they're very similar. Anyway, I won't belabor it. Thank you.
David, we've made a note of that, and we'll again take a look at it and see if there's any additional work we can do there.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, David. I do want to acknowledge Brian Kessler, alternate for programmatic accrediting agencies at the table. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, so David, I just wanted to sort of remind that the concept in 17, so 17 is the application of the standards that are laid out in 16. So but in 16, they're fairly restricted in sort of what the actual criteria are. They're not as restricted in terms of sort of suggesting to accreditors and schools for that matter, how they're applied. And so I think what the department's trying to do is mirror to some degree that in 17, they're saying, as it relates to what's already listed in 16A1, A sub 1, you should look at X, Y, Z. So I don't think it's duplicative. I would say, and that's why my card was up, is that going back to 42, which is the actual criteria, I would urge the department to consider keeping the language that has been struck purely because that's what's in statute. And so I just think that you are, as traditionally has been the case, the department has kept 16 pretty close to what the statute is. And so, especially on student achievement. So I would just urge that you keep the lines in so that it's clear that you're not suggesting that you don't care about job placement rate and course completion. So I would just say that you should keep those in.
Thank you, Jennifer. Michael, you have the floor.
I just wanted to note that the words together, student performance, only appear once in the entire document on page 48. And I think it's a really important point that we're talking about student performance when we're talking about accreditors. And so just want to keep that emphasis.
Thank you, Michael. David, did you have something additional?
Yes, I would suggest striking the word valid in that paragraph. It has a particular meaning in data work that you probably don't intend here.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. We will strike that.
Seeing no other cards, Jeff, would you like to move our attention to somewhere else?
Well, after 48 is 49.
49 it is. Monty.
Yeah, thank you. I want to reference or go back and reference the credit for prior learning item that we had discussed. I know when we made the submission initially, it was within 17 that it was covered. I had forwarded back to the group that language on credit for prior learning a few minutes ago. Given the 16-17 split, I didn't really have a specific place to insert it. I thought maybe I would leave that to staff to try to find the right location. But I just simply wanted to go back and reclaim that notion of credit for prior learning as it relates to this section.
To 17 in general, correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
Not to this particular paragraph. Okay.
Got it.
Thank you, Monty. Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you. So on page 49, number 3, maintains a sufficient number of appropriately qualified faculty. I know that we've talked about this, but one of the constituency asked, what is the sufficient number of faculty? So for in my place, I may teach anatomy. Is it a certain number of faculty to student ratio, or is it based upon the curriculum? Is it based upon the type of curriculum that's being delivered? What would we consider a sufficient number of faculty?
I think this is an instance where we would rely on peer review in terms of, it's one of those things, you know it when you see it and relative, but I think it gets into some of the comments that Julie's made about institutional quality in the past with regard to faculty. And again, we want to make sure that that students are getting obviously what they're paying for. And so this I think is something where peer reviewed subjectivity and expert knowledge would come into play.
Any follow-up, Brian? You're good? Thank you. David, you have the floor.
Thank you. We submitted a proposal having to do with the faculty evaluation piece in this section. And I think it's all, you could take it as friendly amendments designed to clarify the language for peer review. But one of them is a Romanet 2, maintains faculty appointment structures to address persistent deficiencies in instructional quality, program relevance, or institutional effectiveness, that I couldn't figure out how to make peer reviewable because we'd have to, so I recommended striking it, which obviously may need some rethinking, but I couldn't figure out how to make that peer reviewable to connect an appointment structure to outcomes. Like what evidence would we have that says, no, your appointment structure is not conducive to certain outcomes? So maybe think about it or consider what the intent there is. Just a suggestion.
Yep. Thank you, David. Appreciate that. And we will review that one tonight.
Thank you, David. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, so since we're sort of, I guess I'm going to introduce the structural issue now that I just, so we talk about faculty, which I'm all for in terms of qualifications a lot. And we being Michael and I, with the support of several other negotiators, I think there were four primaries and then their alternates submitted where purely, well, there are other substantive changes, but one of the big pieces that I think we care a lot about is structural, so that it's clear that, for example, in 3, the conversation around faculty qualifications, that all discussion in this section relating to faculty criteria or qualifications are all together. And so like maybe with a precursor along the lines of what we suggested, which is somewhere in the document that I put forward. Actually, it's on page 40 of the proposals document that the negotiators at least all have. So that it sort of starts off by saying, when applying its standards according to 602.16, and then the reference to faculty, it evaluates whether an institution, and then from there, all issues related to faculty are listed together. And that way it's really clear to the reader, whoever the reader is, that the section is going sort of criteria by criteria in terms of application. So I just wanted to, I'm just going to say that once rather than every time it comes up. But the proposal, I think, is on whatever page it is in the proposal document.
Thank you, Jennifer.
So Jennifer, looking at that, I mean, they do generally track together. So I think we could, I mean, I understand what you're saying. We should probably nest this under a not even the heading, but sort of an operable paragraph that sort of does your laundry list. But that would take us, I think, to page 51. Again.
So and so for example, on page 51, you go back to, so to Dave's point, do you see what I'm saying? So at the very start on 48, you have a reference to, which is really a reference to A1, and then you pick it back up here. So do you see what I'm saying? So I think the student achievement stuff should be put together, the faculty stuff should be put together. That's all I'm saying. Okay.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Mark, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm coming back to Brian's question about maintaining a sufficient number of appropriately qualified faculty. I want to come back to the discussion, I believe it was earlier today, about student input and that can be obtained during the site visit. If it is learned that time to degree is delayed because of the lack of availability of prerequisite or required courses, that would be evidence that they're not maintaining a sufficient number of appropriately qualified faculty. So I think that is probably one of the available metrics, is just looking at whether or not students are able to graduate in a timely and on schedule manner consistent with their degree programs, or whether a lack of availability of courses, which is tied to lack of availability of faculty and or space, would be the issue. And I would hope the department is agreeable to that.
Thank you, Mark. Jeff?
So to clarify, you would ask for additional requirements under faculty that are related to student achievement?
No, what
level?
I'm saying is that Brian had asked earlier, what
Yeah.
about maintain sufficient faculty? I'm saying one of the very clear example, he was asking about metrics or definitions. One of those would be that the students are unable to get the courses they need in a timely manner to complete their degree programs as expected or on schedule.
Thank you, Mark. Michael, can we hear from you?
On page 49, Romanet 1, capital A, B, and C. Capital C is, I think, puts accreditors in a position to be potentially evaluating whether or not an institution should have fired a faculty member for what is here sustained non-performance. And those definitions are probably not clearly stated or certainly agreeable even amongst the parties. And so, my recommendation would be just collapsing Romanet 1 to simply say maintains and applies written faculty performance evaluation policies that include defined performance criteria and are conducted on a periodic basis. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you, Michael. Magnus, can we hear from you?
Sure. I just wanted to thank Mark for his earlier point and echo the sentiment there. I've seen a lot in my experience, students who may not have a course available to them, or it's only taught in a specific semester or every other academic year or something along those lines. And that does lead to significant additional time to complete a degree, which can also lead to stop-outs or dropouts. So wanted to echo that.
Thank you, Magnus. Brian?
To both Magnus's and Mark's point, I do agree with that, but some of the programmatics do not necessarily specific courses. They actually do continuum across the board. So again, in terms of my example, I think it's as defined as the program seems appropriate. So in terms of team-based learning, TBL, problem-based learning, there's different types of modes of delivery that, from an accreditor standpoint, as long as that's articulated, then the faculty number is commensurate.
Thank you, Brian.
Are there any more specific to faculty? I know we're skipping around a little bit here, but before I sort of go further down into the criteria, we want to try to capture all the faculty-related comments if we can.
Any additional faculty-related comments or questions before we move on? Seeing none, Jeff, let's move forward.
Okay. So really at the bottom of page 50, we go from faculty and staffing down to program length. So the first one is Romanet 7 at the bottom of page 50, which talks about program length.
AD, please.
So I didn't realize you were skipping to the bottom of 50. I just wanted to go back to the top of page 50. You know, we mentioned before that, so we did have originally a proposal that would add a paragraph regarding a religious, both accreditors as well as institutions with religious missions. So that was not accepted when we originally proposed it. And if, I don't know if you want to explain, or if we will likely put forth a second chance at maybe something that would be a tighter exemption that would meet the department's.
So since we're restructuring the requirements around academic freedom based on the last caucus, I think we can handle that. Our plan was to handle that there, because we knew that was sort of the structure of that hadn't been fully baked yet, and so that would move from here into the discussion with academic freedom.
So I don't know if Jake wants to respond, because I discussed with Jake about putting it into later on when a definition of academic freedom, as opposed to up here where it mentions academic freedom, but it's not a definition.
Right. So that was consistent on the previous structure to some extent, because that definition is incorporated in here. So that definition already had religious protections baked in. So I didn't think it was necessary to include it in the definition, because it's duplicative in the definition. And I didn't think it probably did anything here, but I was saying that if you thought it belonged anywhere, it would belong in this section. I think because we're rewriting, or we're reworking the idea of how we're handling academic freedom, if that definition isn't going to be there, it definitely would be in here, but we are going to tinker with this a little bit, and we'll probably handle it there. If you want to submit a draft where you think it belongs, that's okay. I think actually there's already religious freedom protections baked into this section to some extent, but if you want explicit language on it, please submit it.
I mean, we have the rationale from your previous one, so I mean, we can apply it there. I'm not sure we need language, because you haven't seen the new structure and how we're going to do that. But I think we can bring the concept in. I mean, the rationale into the new discussion, make sure that it's addressed.
Okay, I appreciate it, because I was talking to Bill also, with some of the faith-based institutions. So how about we have the original rationale and language obviously has to fit into the new one. We could submit something, other options, and then you'll figure out what works best.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else on page 50 before we move on? Magnus, please.
I'll just say generally about this section, the students find this to be fairly a good section, because it ties program length to outcomes and avoiding programs that are simply just too long. So we appreciate that.
The majority of these changes are an attempt to make sure that programs are right sized to the objective. and we don't have credential creep.
As there are no additional comments or questions on 50, I suggest we move on.
Okay, we can go to 51, which is still dealing with program requirements.
Jeffrey, can we hear from you?
Sure. I just would like to recommend to the department, since taking Jennifer's suggestion back on 42, unstriking the language which goes into including as appropriate, that on page 51, little b, where it starts talking about agency must review, to massage that language just to simply match page 42 to page 51.
Thank you. David, can we hear from you?
Yes, thank you. I had the same comment about changing the must, but I think I understand some of the frustration with student achievement and wanting to do something new. And I saw that on the CIKI. Jen co-chaired a report, which you might want to reference from 2023. And I'm going to quote a bit of it. It starts memorably with, as a result of the statutory mess, and proceeds to talk about student achievement, suggesting that one of the problems is that that under certain accreditation regimes, each institution can create its own version of what student achievement looks like. And that one of the things, speaking for myself on the CIKI, one of the problems this creates is there's no unifying sense of student achievement that is auditable at that level. We can't sort all the actions and look at the institutions and make sense of sort of what's the dividing line between what's acceptable and not. So I wonder if, in addition to Jeffrey's suggestion that we allow institutions and agencies to have flexibility about the outcome measures, we ask in here somewhere, wherever it's appropriate, that agency standards must identify minimum expectations with the intent of having some kind of scorecard that's auditable. And I know this isn't regulatory language. I'm just suggesting the idea. Is that something the department might be interested in?
Are you talking about single bright lines or standards based on institutions' goals and missions and where they currently are?
I hate to use the word bright line. I think the the accreditors would have to decide what's appropriate for their kind of institution or program, but it would have to be comprehensible in the sense that there's something like a minimum standard of acceptability, I think, to pass the plausibility test.
I think that's something we can discuss. I would sort of avoided sort of a going that route, but if there's interest, again, we can certainly take a look at that.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, David. Brian?
Thank you. So A and B, I know that we looked at the short term, but the certificate or degree programs, when we talk specifically about achievement, student achievement, this doesn't preclude competency-based education that may increase the level of education, because based upon competency achievement, sometimes it's decelerated educational process. That's something that's being talked about. And on the contrary, competency-based education may be achieved in a shorter time frame. This wouldn't preclude that, would it?
I don't think so. And from at least from what I've seen, there seems to be accommodation, particularly within several accreditors for competency-based models. So I don't see a conflict. Clear. I mean, I don't think this conflicts with it, but I also don't see it generally to be a conflict.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jeff. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, I want to thank Jeffrey for bringing up the must. I think, so this goes, again, so David, you said you mentioned minimum. Page 48, and this is why page 48 and 51 need to be joined, because on page 48, you do use the terms minimum expectations, which I've sort of just swallowed. You'll be happy to know. And I like the word, and I would just say, like, so if you keep that language to using expectation rather than requirement is good, just to keep it sort of as which is consistent with statute. You didn't do that. So just expectations is better than requirement. That way it's less of a benchmark because it's just an expectation rather than a hard and fast benchmark. So that's just my 2 cents on that. And then on the must piece, I'm trying to, and I don't have it in front of me, but the such agency must, instead of that, there's like, again, the statutory language is like including but not limited to, may include but not limited to. I would go there, honestly. I know you might want to be more robust than that. I'm just saying that. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. David.
Just wanted to say, I think that's a very elegant solution. If we can keep the minimum expectations and give flexibility to what that means, that would be perfect. Thank you. That was brilliant.
It's in what we gave you signed off on it. It's what we sent. It's what we sent them last week.
Thank you.
There are no additional cards at this time, so we can move forward in the text.
I think that brings us to 52. We start off with post-completion and graduation outcomes.
Jeffrey, please.
Thank you. We brought this concern or this question up the other day about including employment data in the outcomes, given that the earnings premium was just passed. Is this something that we are looking at removing because we already have the information from earnings premium, or is this additional data and additional burden for the schools?
Yeah, so I think in our current working draft, we took Michael's suggestion and are going to propose to replace the reference to the wage data to the earnings premium.
Excellent. Thank you.
Data.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Jeff. Anything else on page 52? Jennifer, please.
Just to be clear on that, thank you. Just to be clear on that point, is it just for the wage data, or then you go still on 52, you have the cost benefit analysis? Is that different? So there's the Romanet 5, educational economic returns. And then on the cost benefit analysis, that's different, right? That's well, I guess I'm asking.
Sorry. One is an input, one is the calculation writ large. So I think the wage data is an input to the calculation, which is the cost benefit analysis. So they are different. Yeah. But we're not fully taking out 5 and just saying you have to satisfy that. Yeah, because that would be duplicative of other regulations.
So, I mean, to be more specific on Romanet 5, so where there's the reference to assessed using reliable wage data, that's where we would make the replacement with the new earnings data.
Any follow-up, Jennifer, before I move on?
Well, so do you mean, so can we just play it out so that because you're going to do the work on the metric, and so such and such program, let's take it at the institutional level. Let's say like they have however percentage of their programs fail, right? And so you're just expecting that you're going to do your own thing as the department. And then in addition to that, the accreditor, you're basically saying, which I agree with, the accreditor should look at how they performed under that metric and decide whether that's impactful.
And the important thing to note is, in particular some of the smaller programs, those programs are not going to be out automatically. In some cases, they'll be calculated. In some cases, there's not enough to be. They'll have to be combined over multiple years. So there's a couple of different variations, but I think the expectation here is that prior to an action by the department, there is some data that is very similar to the reliable wage data that we were requiring, and that this could be a proxy, a readily available proxy for that data, and could be used to determine outcomes.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Beth?
Also, I just want to say the cost benefit analysis is applicable to different sections of the standard. So it's related to student support services and facilities and equipment. So different application.
Thank you, Beth. Michael, you have the floor.
I'm not sure that there is value in moving to the federal premium definition, and here's why. If the program violates that definition, it's not going to be eligible for federal student aid anyway. So why would the accreditor be involved in that role?
But it may prior to getting to because it may or may not lose eligibility is sort of the first test, right? And it may not lose eligibility the first time it's measured. So I guess what we're saying is that this is data that's available to the accreditors that gives them not a perfect look, but gives them a look at the performance of those programs relative to earnings.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that by changing the word from wage data to that specifically, it narrows the body of wage data and student outcomes longitudinally that accreditors would be looking at. And what we want to encourage, because this is a fast-moving, very nascent space, meaning UI wage matching and how it's calculated, efficiency ratios and all of that kind of thing. We're doing a lot of this in Ohio right now. The idea of just passing a threshold is not a continuous improvement on wage outcomes for students necessarily. There is a sanction power that exists elsewhere. And so it's a little bit duplicative if the accreditors focused on that. I would rather keep that as an illustrative example of one of multiple employment measures that you could look at, but I wouldn't, and right now it's a must, so the accreditors have to look at this data. But I fear that it will not only be a must, but it's also going to be a guide as to what is best practice. And so if they focus on that, it's not very much value.
All right. I'm looking at you and Mike simultaneously. What if we made that particular piece of it an or? Because I understand, I mean, there are a number of states that are sort of having more robust measures of UI wage data that would also be available, and it's being done in the workforce context. What if we gave the accreditor the option to use either one? I mean, the earnings measure will be universal. The UI measures will depend on the state. The UI measures are a better measure in those states than what we're proposing here. Like what our measures are because of the different ways that that's calculated.
I'm generally supportive of that. I would just say not or, because that's mutually exclusive. I would say including but not limited to. So it's an example. The federal premium measure is a ratio that is a wage employment outcome.
Michael McComas, what say you on those options?
I mean, 50 states, 50 different ways of getting information. And what my experience has been thus far from an agency that does a lot around employment, it has actual employment benchmarks, that, you know, there's just not a real consistent and reliable source for accreditors to get that data. Even if we ask for it from the institutions, I still don't find it to be particularly reliable. And so, you know, having sat on the AHEAD committee and seen the level of detail that is going into the earnings premium and how that's being calculated, just based on my own experience of what we've tried to use in the past, I find it to be a far better measure. And to Jeff's point, if we use it the way that we effectively use cohort default rates, and I'm not in any way suggesting that cohort default rates are a good or right measure. I'm just saying if we use it along that same, like we don't wait until they fail. We are evaluating first year, and then hey, you're in the danger zone. And my agency's trigger points for looking at that are actually lower than the department, so that we can be more proactive in trying to get that moved along. So I would suspect, at least from my perspective, that would be the approach that we would want to take. I'm not opposed to an or. As long as there's some option there. But I do think that accreditors can gain a lot from using this and working with their triad partner at the federal government, because again, the work that you're doing there is far better than what I've seen in most any other area.
Yeah, I think what we have here is we have two trains that are moving. They're moving pretty fast, and they're moving parallel to one another. Chancellor Duffy's point on the enhanced UI, the efforts in states on enhanced UI wage records, where that would be available quarterly, and that's a big initiative of the Department of Labor, which we are supportive of. I think would give you data. I mean, we put this in and made the reference to it specifically because we knew you were having problems getting data. And so to the extent that we said, okay, we have this data, use this. But I think it's equally important to know that there's also another source of data being done through the enhanced UI wage records, which maybe is a station or two on the train tracks behind where we are here. But nonetheless, I think it is going to be a good source of information if you're looking at if you're looking for earnings.
I have a question for Mike. So in that data, is it because you'd mentioned about the issue being that at least the earnings premium is a ratio, it kind of gives a measure against something else, so we know if they're up or down. Does the UI data do something similar?
Well, the language that we were discussing would not be specific to a specific methodology or ratio. It would just be to say more broadly that employment outcomes could be looked at. And so it would give flexibility to creditors to choose from an entire a la carte menu. You could look at that ratio, but as I said, I think that ratio is not that relevant because it's already applied in other contexts in a way that really matters a lot. It's a pass-fail test. And one of the problems with thresholds in general, we have this in attainment goals and things like that, is if we say and to your point about cohort default rate, if we say the goal is 15% above a high school diploma, we're going to get 15% above a high school diploma. That's not the aspiration. That's not the ultimate outcome that we aspire to. So we want the wages at all levels to go up. One of the things that minimum thresholds do is they incentivize low common denominator programs that have just enough to get above that threshold, but wouldn't necessarily meet the labor market where it's at currently, which is fast growth in master's degrees, for example, where the wage premium might be very strong.
Thank you both.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate all those things, and I think minimum standards do have a tendency to do that. Let me think on that for a bit and just make sure that I want to make sure we get the right kind of language in that particular area, because again, it's going to be there's some universality here across all programs, and I want to draw just one more point, and that's what I think Jeff had said this, but it's 2 out of any 3 years. A fail means that you lose eligibility to participate in the loan program, but it doesn't make that program go away. I mean, it still is Pell eligible. And so part of my rationale around wanting to use that metric in some way is, yes, that institution has some splaining to do. in the words of Ricky Ricardo. So, they need, they're not just to the department, but it should be a signal to the accreditor that there's an issue here that is worthy of your attention. And so whether it's that they've just fallen below the minimum and they come up and they go down, we should be tracking that program for even our continued recognition of it. And we may have different measures at the end of the day, but I want to make sure that we're capturing the overall intent really of what the premium is trying to drive, which is we're at the bottom.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Michael. Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you. So page 52, Romanet number 5, the wage in terms of tuition and fees in comparison to wage. Going back to Mike's component of the must, how does the constituency avoid antitrust when they're comparing wage and fees to tuition? How is that publicized? Who keeps that internal data? Because what you worry about, are you going to start setting tuition and fees based upon that data?
Page 52.
I can respond to that. So I think that like it only becomes antitrust if it rises to level of collusiveness. You're working with others to set the wages based on that data. If you're simply looking at wage data and using that as a cost comparison and determining whether or not the tuition is reasonable relative to the wages, that's not the same as collusion in that regard. That's just responding to markets. It would become collusion, if you were just flat out setting, or I guess working with institutions or potentially people in the industry to, impose full standards, price floors or price ceilings or something like that in there. But, to the extent that you're using information out there, that's actually what we want you to do. That's really the opposite of collusive behavior because you're imposing things on your institutions.
Yeah, and it's an analysis, right? It's a reasonableness test.
Thank you both. Thank you, Brian. Mark, you have the floor.
So I think I might be channeling Mike Duffy, but I'm not sure, which is, given that on an annual basis, the department is evaluating all programs on earnings premium, what is the necessity of having it in accreditation? That is, I guess, my question. Was that your question?
Would you like to respond?
What I think I'd like to say is that the history of higher ed in the United States is defined by minimum thresholds. Really, there's a barrier to entry to become an institution. And then beyond that, there's not much built into the system to kind of push quality other than peer review. And now we have the science to look beyond the degree production and inflation and say, what are the long-term outcomes for students? And so this is the most exciting area of higher education today. And to think that accreditors wouldn't be invited at least to make it part of, now they have flexibility as to what threshold they pick, what specific metrics they choose to define their mission around, but that they wouldn't go into that space at all if this was not in the language, I think is the threat to that progress that we're making right now and innovation, I think, in higher ed.
Jeff, did you want to speak on that as well?
So the new earnings test, it doesn't really look at the cost of the program it looks at the credential level, but it's really a test of a program versus the general population at a particular time in their lives. So it's much different than what's being asked here, which is much more granular and is looking at that particular program in that particular field versus people in that field and whether or not there's the appropriate balance between cost and the prevailing earnings data for graduates.
Thank you all.
Yeah. To be clear, our standard is the minimum. If you take the data, though, that we use in calculating whether or not a school satisfies that data, you can do what you will with it. Accreditors could set a higher, minimum earning threshold of their own, or they could take action quicker than we can. So that's part of the cost benefit analysis part here that works. As Jeff said, it's fully separate from our test.
Thank you all. Monty, please.
Thank you. At the risk of maybe stating the obvious, I thought maybe it might be important to kind of go back and look at the broader picture here. If you maybe took a 40-year perspective of higher education, you look at the history, as you just pointed out, Michael, earnings would not have been in a document that looks like this 40 years ago. This is a march forward in explaining to the public in America exactly what higher education will deliver for you. Now, no guarantees, right? We all recognize that, but we have tools to help us to get there. So I think point number one is labor market related data, employment related data is valuable in describing the value we produce as higher education institutions for our students. Let's not lose that as we're describing or talking about item number 5, where yes, there may be tools out there that are more beneficial to us than we've had in the past, but let's not miss the point. We are slowly but surely moving in a direction of an external market evaluation of the value of that credential. I know that's uncomfortable the way I just said it for some folks, but it's the reality. So I appreciate the direction the department is headed here. I think it's important that we state it the multiple times that it has been stated in this document so that people get the point. This is where we're headed. Thank you for your work.
And I will acknowledge not everybody agrees with this. There are some folks that are very dear and dear to my heart that have worked in this building that don't agree with it. But I don't think they're right. I think when you're talking about taxpayer commitment and support for these programs, the expectation is that there's an earnings that can support borrowing, and that there's an earnings benefit for giving someone grant assistance to help them with their program.
Thank you, Monty. Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to go to David's card, and then I'm going to suggest we move along. David, please.
Yes, thank you. And this goes back to the necessity of removing the must so that agencies have the flexibility to ask why questions. If we're going to innovate and modernize, we have to get to an understanding of the processes. Otherwise, we'll get perverse effects. For example, all the post-graduation metrics should really have zeros or negative numbers entered for every student who didn't complete. And if we only care about the post-graduation metrics, there are perverse incentives to identify weak students and help them not complete or not admit, admit only the best Title IV students to programs, these kinds of things. And also the burdens that we add to programs in terms of reporting will discourage institutions from creating those new programs. That's already the case. So I hope that we can move in the direction of, I'll use the word innovation here. Thank you.
Thank you, David. No additional comments or questions, so let's move along in the text.
I'm hesitant to jump to the next page because I think the last paragraph on this, Jennifer had spoken to it, on page 52, which is the cost benefit analysis on the other end, which is for a different set of requirements, is also here. So I will start the move to page 53 by starting at the bottom of page 52. See if there's any comments there.
Michael.
I don't have a solution for you, but I was having this discussion with an accreditor who raised kind of the question of the specificity of the section. And one of the things that I thought about was how input driven this is right now. You're trying to do this calculation. It's going to be non-standardized across all the different accreditors. In the financial statements, though, for every institution, we can find out what their plant costs are as a percentage of their total expenditures, and that's audited by an independent financial auditor. And so I find that to be a more standardized, more useful, industry accepted measure. And I think we may want to think about how can we measure facility bloat or over expenditure from an outcomes ratio standardized approach rather than, hey, accreditors, come up with whatever methodology you want to and do some kind of cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, I agree. They have access to that. I think also the iPads finance modules pick a lot of that up. I know that doesn't capture everybody in terms of respondents in the universe, but those are the institution's audited financials and iPads are both sources that are available.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jeff. Siri, can we hear from you?
Just a small point, but sometimes the aggregate doesn't pick up all the things that are going on, right? These are like multinational companies with different business units. And we've seen, without saying them, the firings at a big school in Northeast Ohio, a couple of privates last week announcing closures. So the question is, at what level do you look at this data inside the university? Because it might look great on the whole, but actually might be subsidizing seriously underperforming and under-enrolled aspects.
Thank you, Siri. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think I was kind of going to say, I think what Siri is saying, and I just want to make sure, I don't want to rely, I think most accreditors, and Michael will speak to this, but I think most accreditors do look at financial audits but I definitely don't want them to rely on that alone. So I kind of like the list, because it encourages, or sort of requires, that they go in deep, because I think in my experience, the audits aren't always, they don't always tell the story.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeff?
Right, 53. So any comments on 53?
Not seeing any at this time. Does anybody need an additional moment? Monty, please.
Apologies. If we could go back to the prior section on ROI and cost benefit analysis. I think we'd submitted, believe it was April 27, some language around the cost benefit analysis in an attempt to try to clean that up a bit. I just wanted to reference it again as an opportunity to kind of streamline a little bit of it. But if not, certainly understand. But I just wanted to go back and mention.
Okay, we'll go back, take another look at that tonight.
Does anyone have any comments, questions on 53? If not, I'm going to ask Jeff that we move forward.
So if we go from 53, then we start getting into what we talked about before on academic freedom, I think on 54, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll skip over that part because it's already being addressed in that effort. And the same thing on the rest of 54. Rest of 55 is current language. And there really aren't any new changes until we get to the top of page 57.
Actually, just to highlight, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Michael.
Just to highlight on 56, we had talked previously about deleting self-study and.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike. We had that. In our working draft, we had your other comments as well. So we're looking to expand that term to include comprehensive review, which would include self-study, but it's not be specifically limited to self-study. Calling that's not the only way you can do it.
Do you have any follow-up, Michael, before I move on? Okay, Michael.
Top of 57, it administers standards and review processes in a manner that, and I would ask for consideration of the inclusion of seeks to reduce unnecessary barriers.
Would seeks to be referencing the standards of the agency or the actions of the institutions?
The standards of the agency. So I have to go back to the root now.
I see, because the
the agency is administering its standards and review processes in a manner that seeks to reduce unnecessary burdens.
Right, because you're just measuring it.
Well, I'm just worried about the staff. No, I mean, the very capable staff of the department measuring whether or not we are in fact reducing quote unquote unnecessary burdens or just making an effort to. So.
Thank you, Michael. Any follow-up there before I move on?
We've noted it. I think that's something we can work with.
Okay, Magnus, you are next.
Yeah, same paragraph there, J at the top of 57. I'm just having a little bit of trouble reading that paragraph. So the second line there, it says that reduces unnecessary barriers that limit allows institutions, but continuing from there, limit allows institutions or programs from to adopting instructional. So maybe I'm dyslexic. I don't know, but I'm having a little trouble reading that paragraph.
So it's that limit. Yeah. Sorry. I believe it's that allows institutions to adopt instructional practices. Yeah, I think that's it, but we'll fix that. Thanks, Magnus.
Okay, thank you, Magnus. Jennifer, you have the floor.
I just want to point out, per what Michael was his recommendation, that you actually, for consistency purposes, seeks to make sense because it's in K already as it relates to K.
Yep.
So it's really conforming at it.
We are going to bring alternate Bill Hathaway for private nonprofit institutions to the table as we move forward to the next section in the text.
Okay. Are we done on 57? And can we jump to 58, or is there anything on 57 people want to discuss?
Does anyone have any additional comments or questions around 57? We're good to move.
Okay. So we're on 58 now. Again, this was all new text, all unchanged from the last draft, but we remain open, and there may have, I can't recall off the top of my head, there may or may not have been some language on this that covered it. I mean, in proposals.
Michael, please.
Pretty sure there was. And so on 58, I'll point out again that in many instances, institutions believe that accreditors' findings and monitoring outcomes and enforcement actions are materially incorrect. And so Romanet 4 on 58 there would be, again, one of those areas that I think could use, some work with regard to the expectations that the department has for what an agency has to do in those instances. It's a stem from one, does not make false, misleading, or material incomplete statements regarding. And so again, my fear is that it becomes an issue of institutions making claims that finding or an outcome. There already exist complaint policies. And any institution can complain to the department or to anyone else that an agency was wrong. Obviously, if we're in an adverse setting, there's an appeal process, there's an arbitration process, and others. So just something for consideration.
Thank you, Michael. AD, you have the floor.
Just a quick typo correction. I think when you renumbered on 58 and 59, LMN, on the bottom of 59, after M is L. Or is that one? But then there's a one? Looks like an L.
Is there a response to that we can get on the mic so it's picked up for the record?
Yeah, so I believe this is the reason why this is highlighted is because that is an L. And so the next one is 1, and then there's a Roman at 1, 2, 3, and then there's a 2. And then when you go to page 59, you'll see a highlighted M. Yeah. That's to show that is the next. So so the first one is L, the next one is M.
Below though. It goes back.
That's no, that's a 1.
It's not. There's the 2.
No, I took it. I put it in a Word doc. It's an L.
Okay.
Then we went in afterwards.
We will look at the lettering and numbering here.
Thank you very much, Beth. I am going to note that we are 5 minutes from 4. There are a couple of more cards up. Please don't put any new cards up. I'm going to work my way through these 2 and then check in with the department on our departure. Jennifer, you have the floor.
I just wanted to, so on Michael's suggestion or thought on L, and then M, and then sort of the rest of it, just our proposal had suggestions. Some of it was deletion, but some of it was moving it to other sections. And so it's pages 48 to like 51 or something like that of the proposals document. So I just wanted to point you in that direction.
We'll take a look at that. And I'm not sure where the other questions are, but before we conclude, I'd like to get some feedback with regard to the last one, which is O, which was new text in this version. So.
All right. I've been overridden. You can put cards up on O. Brian, you were next.
Can I just make one comment? In terms of what Michael said, and I think in terms of what Jennifer proposed in some of the documentation, one of my concerns is that there's no indication of safe harbors here or protections for agencies, even if the decision has changed on appeal, or essentially means any errors or omissions and things like that would be a violation of the criteria. Is there any consideration for those safe harbors?
I mean, since this section deals with the application of the standards from 16, I'm not sure what we could do in terms of a safe harbor. Traditionally, the departments use safe harbors when there's been ambiguity with regard to the requirements or guidance has been inconsistent, and there aren't any regulations or things like that in place. So on a particular topic. So I don't know specifically what you'd be seeking safe harbor for.
Just if the decision was overturned or something, that it doesn't, the agencies in terms of the institutions aren't coming back, and have some sort of argument back that, look, we were successful on appeal. You're in violation of this. That I think that's what's going to happen is you're going to have more complaints coming this way. If that makes sense, in terms of how this is being promulgated.
An appeal within your own agency.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's you following your policies, right? Because that's if they're working through your own policies and it's overturned internally, I don't see any issues there.
Thank you, Jake. Jeff? Okay. Bill, you have the floor, please.
So I was just going to comment on O since you had asked about that. So certainly I think this is an important area, but I'm still thinking through how this gets implemented. This covers a lot of detail here, and it's also quite prescriptive on the kinds of things that should be done, but prescriptive in a way that focuses on research integrity in certain lines of research, maybe in certain fields more than others. So more data collecting kind of research projects. And I think the general point that an agency makes sure that its institutions have policies to address this, to monitor, to deal with it, that seems pretty reasonable to me. But when we go beyond it to this level of detail, it seems to me like it's setting up quite a bit that might have unintentional consequences here or areas of neglect and that we're not focusing on. So I'm not sure what I think about this yet, but I'm concerned about it being introduced at this stage in quite this form. So.
Thank you, Bill. Michael, you have the floor.
Just to go back on little L1, I think in the I think I had proposed before, at least at a minimum, knowingly make was one of the suggestions there as well. So if you're not persuaded to strike 4, I would still ask for knowingly regardless. On M, there was some talk about peer review, and so I did send over to the department a potential, thought around peer review and other reviewers. So I might suggest making a corresponding edit here that would be and train peer and other reviewers periodically. But I would also suggest a period after modalities. The rest of that seems to be determinative of a particular point of view on whether or not it just states that this is not something that is allowed. And so I think that the second half of that section is maybe a bit much.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, the last 24 hours seems like a little bit of a blur. I feel like we talked a little bit about O yesterday, and I just want to say that I think that O can be reduced to, a literal, almost a phrase, but maybe even a sentence. But I would put it, because I understand the department's interest on it. I support it, I believe, depending on how it gets written. But like a sentence under the section on faculty qualifications, because to me it goes into, or you could do it under curriculum, I suppose, because students also do research, but I feel like it's a better fit. I don't know. You guys can decide, but as long as it zeroes in under one of the existing criteria.
Yeah, I hear you on the shortening part. I think the reason why we put it here is because research can be, not all researchers teach. And so there are principal investigators that work on research who may or may not be teaching at that particular moment. So that's why we put it here as opposed to as part of the faculty to make that distinction.
I would caution the department to abide by the criteria that's in the statute, because that would be, you're in effect, you're creating a new criteria, which I think runs afoul. Because you're not applying anything. Section 2, so this section is literally headed, applicability of the standards that are in 602-16, which are the ones that are created by statute. And so this doesn't flow. And so I was trying to help you make it.
Yeah, and I understand where you're going with that. To me, it would seem illogical to have a standard. I mean, and the corollary of what I just said is there are faculty that do research. And so it seems it would be inconsistent, I think, to have a standard with regard to research, that didn't include everyone that was doing research.
Thank you. Mark, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think we talked about this at length yesterday, but I want to say again, I think the way this is written, it's a bridge too far. I think it expands the scope of the role of the department that in place it doesn't belong. I'm fine with something to the effect, and I think Mike said this yesterday, and I think Jennifer just implied it again. Fine with the agency having to be assured that the institution has a policy and procedures for integrity of research and scholarly activity, but all this other stuff is already covered by responsibilities of other federal agencies, and neither the department nor the accreditors are prepared to take on this additional role. And there's no point of it. It's actually duplicity, and it's actually only going to add more confusion and burden to the process. I think, having policies and procedures are fine. Going down into the same detail that all your sister and brother federal agencies are already doing is duplicative, unnecessary, and wasteful of taxpayer dollars.
Thank you, Mark. Magnus.
The students agree with Mark and Bill on this point. We think it might be a little overly prescriptive, and research integrity is heavily regulated by granting agencies. But they have put it a lot more eloquently and articulately than I can.
Thank you all for a very robust and productive dialogue. Department, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Again, appreciate this discussion. This helps us fine tune this section. And again, we will be taking this back and reissuing 17 along with the comments that we received to tighten it up.
Thank you. And we'll see you all tomorrow morning.